Hey, welcome to today's webinar. My apologies, this is a little bit late because technical difficulties. What can we do? Certain things are not dependent on us. So what I thought we would do this term is on Monday to do things which are more topical, like we did this week about music. And on Thursday to end off the week with something more focused on the Parsha, the Torah portion of that week. So this week's Parsha is Parshas Yisro, which is most famous for the dramatic event that happens in the middle of the Parsha, which is the giving of the Torah, Matan Torah. Matan Torah is the foundation of our religion. It's found in the prophet, but we saw God himself. What I want to focus on, however, is actually the beginning of the Parsha, a little bit less well known. And that part of the Parsha talks about a very interesting exchange between Moshe Rabbeinu and his father-in-law, Yisro. What happens? Yisro is Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law, who lives in Midian, goes to greet Moshe Rabbeinu. And to bring him his wife and his children. What happens is he comes and he sees an interesting thing. He sees that Moshe Rabbeinu is the leader of all the Jewish nation. He sees that he's standing an entire day judging the Jewish people. Every single person which had a fight, every person which had an argument, whether it was monetary or whatever it was, came to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu sat from morning till night resolving everybody's issues, telling them what the Torah has to say, telling them what God has to say. And Yisro was upset about this. He was a little bit of a meddling father-in-law who got a little bit involved in what his son-in-law was doing. And he said, I don't understand you. Why are you sitting a whole day judging the Jewish people? First of all, you're worn out, and even more importantly, you're making the Jewish people stand for hours. It's not nice to them. It's not nice to the Jewish people themselves. So Moshe Rabbeinu asks God what to do, and God tells him, yeah, Yisro is right. You should appoint judges, and they should take care of the smaller issues, and if it's a very big issue, they should go to greater judges, and only the really big issues that nobody was able to resolve should go to Moshe Rabbeinu himself. The obvious question here is, what exactly was so complex and deep and hard to understand what Yisro came up with that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't come up with it himself? Moshe Rabbeinu, greatest person who ever lived, couldn't come up with this idea that maybe we should just make a hierarchy of judges and only the really complex and complicated questions should come to him? What, is that such a novice idea that only Yisro can come up with? Why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu think of that? On the other hand, if Moshe Rabbeinu didn't think of it, we can probably assume that it was wrong. It obviously wasn't the correct thing to do. So why did he end up listening to Yisro? So what is Moshe Rabbeinu's way of looking at this, and what is Yisro's way of looking at it? What are the two approaches here, and why did God side actually with Yisro, not with Moshe Rabbeinu? In fact, the reason why he's called Yisro is because the word portion in Torah, which means that before he came around, this wasn't the outlook of Torah. Only after he came and introduced this idea, then it became the correct thing to do. Why? So the truth is, a very similar thing happens at the giving of the Torah. Again, another part of this week's Parsha, where the first two commandments, God himself says them to the Jewish people. As I mentioned before, this is the only time in history where we had a revelation of God to the common man. And the Jewish people turned to Moshe Rabbeinu and they said, enough, we can't handle it. We cannot handle God himself talking to us. It's too much for us to handle. In fact, it says that every time they heard God's voice, their soul left their body and a miracle happened. They became alive again. So they said to Moshe Rabbeinu, you know what? You talk to God and you tell us what God tells you. And Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Jewish people, you should know that when you told me that, it weakened me. It made me feel weak. I was in pain. Why do you rather hear Torah from me more than hearing from God himself? Why did you give away that opportunity to learn straight from God himself and want to hear Torah from a human being, from Moshe Rabbeinu? But the truth is that the Jewish people were right, because that's exactly what happened. What ended up happening was Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to God, and Moshe Rabbeinu would convey what God told him to the Jewish people. So what are the two ways of looking at this? Hearing Torah from God himself, or having someone in the middle transmitting God's message. And the answer is like this. Moshe Rabbeinu saw the Jewish people differently, but he didn't only see the Jewish people differently. When they were in front of Moshe Rabbeinu, they were different people. He elevated them to a higher level. He elevated them, so to speak, to his level. When they're on his level, they should be able to hear directly from God. However, that is only the way they are, so to speak, under the spell and the effect and the influence of Moshe Rabbeinu. They on their own, who they were essentially, their level, the way they were not next to Moshe Rabbeinu, was much lower than that. So what they were saying is like this. The point of learning Torah, the point of connecting to God, is not only to connect to God when you're under the influence of someone higher, when you're being elevated really beyond who you are essentially. The purpose of serving God and the purpose of learning Torah is to connect Torah to who you are on your level. In other words, to connect to find your connection to Hashem. That it should be what we call bipnimius. It should be something which is internal, something which is connected to me. Not that I'm living Moshe Rabbeinu's connection to God, rather I'm living my connection to God, even if it's lower than Moshe Rabbeinu. Because the fact that God created me on a lower level means that He wants me on my level to connect to God. And therefore, what the Jewish people were saying was, it's true. We can hear from God Himself when we're under your influence, but that's not us. That's not who we are. We want to connect to God on our level. Now, this doesn't mean, the idea was that once it came through Moshe Rabbeinu was able to translate it and explain it to them on their level. In other words, he applied it to them. Not that, God forbid, obviously, it's the same Torah, the way it was coming from God to Moshe, from Moshe to us. Nothing changed. What I mean by on our level, meaning we should be able to internalize the message on our level. The same message, but we should be able to internalize it. And in order to internalize it, we couldn't hear it from God Himself. We had to hear it from Moshe Rabbeinu, who then lowered it down, so to speak, and the same thing happened over here on a more lower sphere when this discussion took place between Yisro and Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to teach Torah straight from him. He didn't want there to be judges in between. The judges would be lower than him. He wanted to teach Torah to the Jewish people on his level. And he wasn't wrong, he was able to. Because again, if they would come in front of Moshe Rabbeinu, if they would come in front of him, they would say that they would be elevated, they would be under the influence, they would be under his spell, and they would be able to learn straight from him. Yisro comes and he tells Moshe Rabbeinu the following. He says like this. When it comes to teaching Torah, you're right. But when people come to you with their problems, when people come to you with their issues, you need to lower yourself down to them, not elevate them to you. You need to understand where they're coming from. You need to understand who they are on their level. And that's why he said, appoint judges who are lower than you. You're too high, you're too elevated to relate to them. You need to appoint people who will be able to relate to them and teach them Torah to them on their level and apply the Torah to their lives, to their specific issues and their things that they're going through, not when they're just elevated and inspired by Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, obviously it's understood that these judges were appointed by Moshe Rabbeinu. There's no such thing as a new Torah. There's no such thing as judges deciding, I'm going to teach a different Torah than Moshe Rabbeinu taught. God forbid. Torah is authentic and has to be taught the same. But the idea was that Moshe Rabbeinu was an incredibly high level, and therefore you needed to find someone lower to sort of relate that down, tell Moshe Rabbeinu's message, which is really God's message, to the people on their level. So the lesson for all of us is that a lot of times when we influence people, the truth is that both of these things are true. Sometimes we need to teach the truth. We need to tell them, we need to be Moshe Rabbeinu. We need to just elevate them, tell them the way it is. But sometimes, if we're trying to help out people with their problems, with their issues, we need to enter into their lives, see where they're coming from, see their life story. It's complex. It's not just an easy solution necessarily. You need to go down and see their background and where they're coming from, and on their level, teach them the truth of the Torah. Don't water down the Torah. Keep the Torah true, but be able to apply it and translate it to them on their level. And that's what Yisro said to do, and it's exactly down to the people and relating to them on Have a wonderful day and a good Shabbos.